two, one.
All right, everybody. We're going to take a look at the last part of the chapter that we've been studying for the past couple weeks, focusing on the end of World War I and more specifically the Treaty of Versailles. Just a couple points to make before we jump into this. One, remember, as a class, we have been emphasizing the idea that history books need neat and tidy little tidbits to basically form their narratives around, and wars fit perfectly into that design for textbooks. So as we go through this material, I'm going to be advancing the narrative that our textbook authors have put together for us, but I'm going to ask you to really think critically about the way that the material is presented to you. And in class, we'll be talking and being a little bit more critical of that narrative as a group. So the main narrative that you guys are going to see is that essentially the major world leaders, specifically the Americans, the French, and the British, at the Paris Peace Conference, in negotiating and designing the Treaty of Versailles, in this political cartoon, they're metaphorically about to chop the head off here of the Germans. And in doing so, they set the stage for World War II. And there's definitely a case to be made for that, and I'm not discrediting it, but I just want you to keep in the back of your mind that usually the cause and effect that we study in history is a lot more nuanced than sometimes textbooks lead you to believe. So before we jump in, I just wanted to share this graphic with you to give you a bit of a frame of reference. If you consider all World War I casualties, notice the United States, being such a late entry, proportionally speaking, did not lose that many soldiers. You notice that the most suffering took place by the Russians, the French, and the British. Now, of course, this is the Triple Entente, so we're not including the Germans or the Austrians in these specific numbers. We'll be looking at those in class a bit. But remember, these are the ones that showed up at the negotiating table who had suffered the most. We're going to be analyzing these political cartoons in class. All right, to the players that you need to be familiar with. Woodrow Wilson, who we've discussed in class quite a bit, showed up in Paris as one of the first real U.S. presidents on an international stage trying to negotiate the terms of peace. Teddy Roosevelt had done something similar earlier in the century, but Woodrow Wilson's role here was far greater in wrapping up the Great War. So his main counterparts were Georges Clemenceau from France, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, and kind of a more secondary character, but the Prime Minister of Italy, Orlando. So Wilson was a huge scholar, a big ideologue to an extent. He believed by putting in motion certain rules that major world leaders could avoid a conflict like World War I again. So, of course, we know again with the gift of hindsight that his vision was incorrect. But some of his most important arguments are still really important for the international community today. So he had a long list of things that he thought would be necessary to preserve peace. So those are called his 14 points. The most important pieces were free trade. So in other words, you could use and maintain shipping routes across oceans with no limitations like the Germans, of course, had been doing to the British. No secret alliances. Alliances should be out in the open. And furthermore, there was an effort to try to limit the amount of military spending that each country could have. The idea being you could avoid arms races. So, of course, that clearly didn't come to fruition, most notably during the Cold War, which we'll talk about later this year. He also promoted this kind of weird idea, self-determination. That's the right of a people, most specifically an ethnic people, to govern themselves. So this goes back to really the origin of the war. When you look at the powder keg in the Balkans, had the Serbians and the Bosnians really been able to determine their own destiny, counterfactually, maybe the war could have been avoided altogether. However, there's a bit of irony if you consider this is the President of the United States talking about self-determination. And if you remember, in a lot of American states, Native American peoples were still not considered full citizens of the United States until I think the late 1920s. So there's a bit of irony there. And then finally, this is the big thing. Inspired by the Greeks, he thought that there was the need for and the design of bringing together different countries into leagues like the Greeks did to avoid future conflicts, because they could defend one another. They could negotiate at tables instead of on battlefields the terms of any qualms that they could have with each other. But the main problems with the treaty, and remember, there was a whole bunch of treaties. The Treaty of Versailles was not the only treaty that came out of the Paris Peace Conference. Some of the issues that came out of the Treaty of Versailles were mainly Article 231, which forced the Germans to take full and total blame for starting and carrying out the most brutal phases of the war. We as a class have analyzed whether or not that's a fair assessment. A lot of you guys do think it's fair. The Germans deserve the bulk of the blame. But I think if you look and think more critically, there was a lot of blame to be passed around. And finally, with the gift of hindsight, we know, historically speaking, that this laid the stage for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in the next decade. But at the time, thinking back to the graphic you saw at the beginning, the British and the French in particular were out for blood. They wanted to essentially neuter politically and militarily the Germans so that nothing like this could ever happen again. Some other points to consider is that the map of Europe that we analyzed before the chapter, after the Paris Peace Conference, is going to look much different. So if you notice, there's a couple countries that didn't exist previously. So all of these Baltic countries ended up kind of forced together into a larger collected group called Yugoslavia. And if you think back to that term that we studied, Pan-Slavism, the idea is there was a collection of ethnic Slavs in this region that joined together. So a couple other countries to highlight. Here you have Poland, smack dab between Germany and Russia. You have Czechoslovakia. You have Austria and Hungary, now split apart, no longer a dual monarchy, split into separate political entities. And a lot of this is going to be seen as overreaching and offensive to the German people. There's going to be a lot of resentment there. And then you finally have the Austrian-born Hitler in the next decade, really looking to get revenge for the terms that he and a lot of other ethnic Germans thought as being truly unfair. I do like the metaphor that the textbooks use when they call this a peace built on quicksand. The idea was this, that essentially the French and the British were out for blood. They tried to be as brutal and as non-cooperative with the Germans as they possibly could. The Germans deserved punishment, and there was no way that there should be any sort of compromise or any sort of conditions factored into their surrender. So on top of that, there was other countries that felt slighted. Most importantly, the Japanese and the Italians. They felt that they were given a real short end of the stick at the Paris Peace Conference, that they contributed to the Allies' cause and weren't given the just desserts from the victory that they helped to lead. So you're going to see that come back and bite the Allies in World War II. So we'll be analyzing a lot of the long-term consequences in class with a little article that I have you guys set up to read. But as you get ready to read that article, think about what I said at the beginning of this video. How much of what the book presents to you as an argument is truly based in fact and how much is